Hey church, it's really great to get to be with you guys. If you don't know me, my name is Josh Doolin. I'm actually the youth pastor here. And for a while, I just want to introduce you to a series that we've been going through the students with through the month of November that has been great. It's entitled Thanks-Giving. And the whole idea behind it is to look at what it is that we have to be thankful for from God. Not to guilt anybody into feeling thankful, but to really understand what it is that God has done for us, that we have and that we didn't deserve, and that was a complete gift from Him. And also the giving part, what does that move us to do? And so that's kind of where my headspace was when Jonathan asked me to preach. For those of you that are my students, this first part where we're going to read some verses, you're going to recognize these verses, but do not tune out. This is a completely new lesson where you're going to learn a little bit more about these verses that we've read. So this is kind of just like an extra added on bonus to that series that we've been in. So before we get started, we're going to read the passage from John 8, verses 1 through 12, and this will actually be our teaching text. And to give a little bit of a background before we read it, Jesus is in the middle, really actually the early part of his ministry here. He has already done a few miracles. He's already started teaching. He's already started preaching. And this is right around when the Pharisees start to scheme against him. So let's read to find out what happens. It says, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all of the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?' They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started writing in the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, 'Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her.' Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard him began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?' 'No one, sir,' she said. 'Then neither do I condemn you,' Jesus declared. 'Go now and leave your life of sin.'" And then there's actually a space in between these two sets of verses, but it goes on. We can understand that Jesus probably went on teaching even that day, and he said, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." This is an amazing story. It really means a lot to me. And what they didn't know in this story at the time, and this woman, the Pharisees, all of them, didn't understand at this time, is that Jesus didn't just say, your sin is okay. In fact, the consequence of sin, which is death, is still paid for. It's not until later in the story we see the extent at which Jesus loved this woman. And it's when Jesus died on the cross and took the punishment of sin for all of us that we see the extent to not only his love for her, but for us. In this moment, with this woman, before the Pharisees, he establishes himself and his ministry he lived on earth for, which was to seek and to save the lost. He has come as the light to the world, not to consume it, not to destroy it, but to transform it. He longed to see the world changed and brought back to him, and he knew the path that he needed to take in order to do that, which was the cross. And there are three people in this story that we can learn from, and we can even see ourselves in. And the first one is the woman's place. Maybe you've never experienced God's tangible love and grace that moves beyond understanding. And maybe, just like this woman, you've been in a place where you just feel so condemned by the world, that the world hates you, that you're not worth anything. Maybe even you're like this woman where the religious leaders that you've met before have made you feel that way too, that you're not worth anything, that you are condemned, that you are going to hell, and that is your story. And I'm here to tell you that Jesus, just like in this story, is reaching out to you. And he's saying that he does not condemn you, that he loves you, that he is here to save you. And there is an alternate way of living than what you are living now. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourself, it is actually the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." And this verse basically explains the whole gospel story, which is that you and I have done nothing to deserve God's grace, and yet his love and his kindness was shown to us in abundance. And for those of us that have been saved before, we've all experienced this moment, right? We've come to the realization. It was maybe when a pastor spoke to us, or when a friend spoke to us, or when we were reading our Bibles, or when we were listening to songs where we felt the burden of our sin, and we, for the first time, understood the length that Jesus went to in order to save our lives. And it's an incredible, incredible experience. But it doesn't just end there, right? We don't just go to heaven after that. The light of Jesus penetrates the darkness in our souls, and guess what? From that point on, we have to figure out how to live here. But Jesus luckily doesn't just leave us in that moment. He gives us a goal. And this goal is ambitious, and this goal is crazy, and this job is so, so important. I don't want to underplay or undermine the importance of this verse. It says in Matthew 5:14-16, we read already, right? In John 8:12, that it says that Jesus is the light of the world. Well, what does Matthew 5:14-16 say? This is Jesus' words again. "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." We have seen him say, like I just said, that he is the light of the world. But what does it say in that verse? We also become the light of the world. I want to tell you how important that is, because Jesus stays on earth for a while, but guess what? He leaves us with this mission that we are to be the light of the world on earth. He's inside of our hearts, and he's living there, and he's teaching us, and he's giving us the ability to do this. And he says, even when he leaves, that he will be with us always in Acts 1. But guess what? We are the only light of the world left on earth that are humans now. Jesus is gone, and that is on us to reflect his light towards others. And this, I don't know if you guys are like me in this or not, but this is actually a really scary moment to me. There are some times where I see this job, that we are to be the light of the world, and I begin to overthink it. Because in all honesty, God lives in us. He's given us the ability to do this and to rest on him. He's told us how to do it. But we can sometimes overthink it. And we can also get to a point where we start to justify our actions based on us thinking that we're the light of the world and we're doing these things correctly. And if you don't believe me, just look at the other people in this story that isn't Jesus. It's the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees, who are the religious leaders of this time. Most people just look at them as like, they're the evil people. Jesus is the good guys. But guys, guess what? They thought that they were doing the will of God. They had studied him their whole lives, and they had really tried to do his will on earth, more so than maybe anyone else at that time. But in this story, what do we see? That while they're trying to carry out God's will, they are actually becoming the antagonists to God himself in the flesh. And that's insane, because it begs the question, are you and I ever doing that? Are you and I ever finding ourselves when we're trying to do God's will actually hindering God's will? Are we actually doing the exact opposite of what Jesus would be doing? I think it all comes down to just one word when we're trying to determine whether or not we're doing it for God or for ourselves, or whether we're doing it correctly, and it's the word motivation. If we look at this story, the Pharisees and Jesus actually have very wildly different motivations. They're both trying to accomplish God's will, but their motivation for doing so is completely different, and that leads us to the difference between doing something for God and doing something incorrectly or the wrong way. It's honestly in life where good and evil are determined, because if you ask any person whether or not they're doing what they think is right, they're probably going to say yes, unless they're just some horrible supervillain, which is probably not like 99.9% of people. Most people will say they're doing the good thing, but if they were to observe their motivations, they might realize that it's actually selfish ambition or something else that is evil. And that is actually causing them to do evil when they're trying to do good. When we look at the Pharisee story, they had a number of motivators as to why they were possibly doing things differently than Jesus. We're going to look at one, and verse 6 actually says the first thing that they were doing, their first motivation, which was that they were trying to trap Jesus. And they were actually willing to hurt this woman. This person that they had brought before Jesus. They didn't really care what happened to her. What they really cared about was one-upping Jesus and catching him in his words and trying to ruin his ministry. And I want to ask, before we move on to the second motivator, have any of you, maybe not even intentionally, hurt someone in the process of just trying to prove a point? Have you ever said something that really hurt somebody else, or done something where you didn't actually care about anything that you were saying, but what you really wanted to do was win an argument? I would say that, especially the time that we live in now, this is rampant in our world. And when we do that with them, we no longer are reflecting Jesus. We're in fact reflecting the Pharisees in this story. And in verse 7, actually, we learn the second motivator, which is that they were acting as though they themselves didn't have sin and that the problem was this woman. Verse 7 says, when they kept on questioning him, meaning Jesus, he straightened up and said to them, "What? Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Jesus is pointing out this fact that we know to be true, which is that none of us are perfect. If you want to condemn another person, you better be perfect before you make that call. And even the person who was perfect, what did he do? He showed love and kindness and mercy and grace. So who are we as people who have been forgiven by Jesus, who were in that woman's position, to do what the Pharisees are doing here, which is to imply that this woman deserves death, not for us to show her the light of Jesus? And this is so dangerous, because what this shows me is that sometimes we can spend so much time in the light when we're out of darkness that we begin to believe that we've been there all along, or we begin to believe that we've earned our spot there. And that's just not true. We know that to not be true, but slowly but surely, the more we live in the light and the more we despise the darkness and don't share the light with the darkness, we can get to a place where we feel like we deserve to be there and they don't. And that moves us into an attitude of being selective about who we show the light of the world to. Even more proof of this is that the law of Moses that they are referring to is actually one that tells them that they need to punish both the man and the woman. But they were selective. They chose the woman, the adulteress, not the man who was also caught in adultery, to throw before Jesus. And they weren't throwing him before a judge. They were simply trying to throw and trip up Jesus. But on top of that, they were selective. They didn't see the sin in their own hearts. And Paul actually has some strong words for those who do this. In Romans 2:1, it says, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself. Because you who pass judgment do what? The same things. Romans 2:4 says something similar, just adding to that, says, or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? And we don't know what Jesus was writing in the sand there, but a lot of theologians like to guess that it was probably something along the lines of what these Pharisees have also in their lives that is sin, or maybe sin that they had dealt with before, whatever it was, that he's trying to show them, listen, you weren't put to death. When you sinned, why should this woman be treated differently? Everyone deserves my forgiveness. And I know when I'm teaching these things, and I try to pass this along to my students, that I'm also learning all of these things as well. And I try to apply my lessons to my life as well. And over the last few weeks, anytime I've started to think, especially about people that I'm annoyed with, or any situation, maybe if it's even small, like I'm driving and I see somebody do some dumb move, or maybe it's just a person that I can't stand the way they talk to another person, or maybe it's somebody that I disagree with online, whatever it is, and I begin to condemn that person in my heart, not pull them aside. I mean, good job, guys, we don't put people to death in the church anymore. But we can condemn them with our hearts and the way we choose to avoid them, or the way that we choose to interact with them. And I just feel God bending over, writing in the sand, and said, listen, Josh, the one without sin, throw the first stone. And he starts to begin to point out in my life areas where I'm not perfect either. And it's not that Jesus hasn't forgiven me for those things, because he has. But I do think that Jesus puts on our hearts things that he's already forgiven us for, to show us that he's done this for us, and then we have no leg to stand on when it comes to not forgiving others. And I know many of you are sitting there thinking, okay, Josh, another lesson about needing to love others, about being kind to people. Josh just wants this church to be a bunch of lovey-dovey hippies who never tell people about their sin and never tells people what they're supposed to be doing. And I want to clear things up right now. That is not my motivation, and that's certainly not Jesus' motivation, which we're going to talk about now. Now, kindness and love was his approach to accomplishing his motivation. But what was his motivation? It says so in verses 10 and 11. It says, Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you." And what does it say here? Jesus declared, "Go now and leave your life of sin." What was his motivation? His motivation was life change. His motivation was repentance. He wanted to get this woman to a point where her life has been touched by Jesus, where it is different, where she's not trapped in sin, because guess what? God doesn't want us to be trapped in sin. He wanted to move her there, but his game plan was love and kindness. Romans 2, that we read before in verse 4, actually explains this perfectly. It says, "Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is what? It's intended to lead you to repentance." And guys, if you want to make sure that you are being the light of the world correctly, that you are being that light that he's called you to be, and that you are reflecting that transformative power that he has already touched you with, this is how we do it. Our game plan is love and kindness. And that love and kindness leads people to change their lives. I have a quick movie clip I want to show you, and then we're going to discuss it. I'm a nerd, so I'm sorry for those of you that aren't, but maybe you'll enjoy it.
Mithrandir. Why the halfling?
I do not know. Saruman believes that it is only a great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found it is the small things. Everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love. Why Bilbo Baggins? Perhaps it is because I'm afraid. It gives me courage.
This actually came from The Hobbit. It's not in the book, so if you're a book snob, you're like, I didn't remember reading that. It's only in the movie. But I love this scene so much because it so perfectly describes what my earthly dad and my heavenly dad have both taught me since I was a little kid, which is that kindness, love, and forgiveness are the most powerful tools we have in our lives. And it can and is the only way that the darkness and evil in this earth is defeated. And I know that is tough. I know that the world combats you and everyone else in a very specific way. We seek power. We seek influence. We seek to one-up one another, sarcasm, like whatever it is. I'm here to tell you that Jesus' game plan is the only one that transforms hearts and changes lives. If you want to see the situations that you're in change, if you want your children or your husband or your wife or your coworker or your students at school, your friends at school, whatever, whoever, change their life for the better, the first step is love and kindness. And I know that 2020 has been a tough year, and next year might carry just as many difficulties, and that your patience and your joy is wearing thin. But if you want to see victories in your life, you have to come to a place where you humble yourself and love unconditionally, show kindness to those who haven't shown you it first, and forgive before a person even asks for it. And I promise you, you will begin to see change in your life. Thank you guys so much. I would ask that in this time, as we just reflect on what Jesus has already done for us, and as we take your communion, whatever it is that you have at your home, to be able to do that, or if you're in your car, obviously don't panic. You can do this later. But as you reflect on what it is that Jesus has done for us, remember this. He has shown you already his love, his kindness, and his grace, and it changed your life. And if it can do that, how awesome and transformative would Lawrenceburg, our state, our country, our world look if we began to do that as a church for others around us? Who would it affect? Whose lives would look differently come next year when we're having Thanksgiving again? Dear God, I thank you so much for this opportunity just to preach and to teach, even if it's online. I just pray that for those who are watching and those who are listening, would just know how much and how far you went for them. And Father, I just pray about what that should move us to do. I thank you so much for the gift that is the job of being the light of the world. And I just pray that none of us in this church take that lightly. That we not for 1 second stop radiating that light. Because there is a world of dying people trapped in darkness who desperately need us. And you have given us the game plan of love and kindness. And I just pray that we don't see that and decide that we have a better way of going about it. I pray that we reflect you in all ways. And that when we don't, that we seek forgiveness for when we don't. We love you, God. And we ask all these things in your name.